The heat of the wasteland was unforgiving, pressing down like a weight on the shoulders of every scavenger, every survivor. But Alara was past feeling its brutal bite. She hadn't had a drop of water in nearly 3 days, and her vision swam as she stumbled over another patch of cracked earth. The sandstorm that had raged the night before had finally calmed, leaving the world a stifling, dust-choked silence. The desert stretched around her endlessly, an expanse of bone-dry earth under a sun that seemed almost taunting. Alara pressed her parched lips together, tasting the last grains of dust on her tongue. She was close to her end, and she knew it. She could see her death unfolding. A final stumble, her legs giving out, and the bleak, lonely stillness swallowing her. And then she heard it, a faint hum in the distance, barely discernible over the beating of her own heart. She froze, blinking against the haze, until finally, a shape began to materialize from the shimmering horizon. A vehicle, sleek, old, and alien among the sands. Alara took a stumbling step toward it, then another, her instincts pressing her forward even as her body threatened to give out. She wasn't sure what she'd find, but at this point, anything was better than the alternative. As she drew closer, she realized that the craft was occupied. A figure, seated inside, seemed to watch her as she approached. She could make out a helmeted face, partially obscured by goggles and a mask. He waited silently, and for a brief moment, Alara feared he would just leave, drive off, and leave her to die. But he didn't. He simply watched, patient and unmoving. "Water," she managed to croak, her voice no more than a whisper. Every word was an effort, her throat like sandpaper. The man regarded her carefully, and then, slowly, he reached into the cockpit and retrieved something. A small pouch, gleaming faintly in the blistering sun. A pouch of water. Alara felt her heart lurch. He held it out, his hand steady, waiting. She couldn't quite believe it. People here killed for water, hoarded it, took any desperate deal in exchange for a few drops. She had been ready to offer him anything, do anything he wanted, give up the last of her strength, her dignity. But he held it out without asking for payment, without saying a word, just offering it freely. Her hands trembled as she took the pouch from him, pressing it to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Which, in that moment, it was. "Why?" she managed, unable to keep the question in. The man tilted his head, as if considering her question. Then his voice came, low and quiet, with a strange softness that felt like a relic of another time, another world. "Not every debt has to be paid in blood," he said. "Sometimes you give what you can, just to remind yourself you're still human." She stared at him, uncertain if she'd heard him right. No one spoke like that anymore. The wasteland had hollowed people out, turned them into hardened husks. She had almost forgotten that kindness could even exist. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt small, inadequate. She raised the pouch to her mouth, and as the first cool drops touched her lips, it felt like life itself flooding back into her. The man watched her silently, his face still obscured by his helmet and goggles. But she could sense the warmth in his gaze, a strange gentleness that lingered even in the harsh light. "What's your name?" she asked, once she'd taken a cautious sip. The liquid revived her enough that she could manage to stand straighter, to feel more than just the immediate desperation of survival. He hesitated, as if he hadn't thought about his name in a long time. "They call me Lucian," he said finally. "Thank you, Lucian," she repeated, the name feeling like a lifeline, something solid to cling to in the endless emptiness. He nodded, his lips curving slightly beneath the edge of his mask. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "Just remember, sometimes it's enough to just survive. But sometimes," he trailed off, as if struggling to find the right words, "sometimes it's about being the person who helps someone else survive too." She nodded, and they stood there in silence, an odd peace settling between them. In another life, another world, she wondered if they might have met in a different way. They might have shared a riverbank, laughed over a table, or traded stories by a fire. But in this life, in this barren world, they only had a single moment to connect. "Where are you going?" she asked finally, unsure if she wanted to hear the answer. Lucian glanced toward the distant horizon, where the mountains loomed like the bones of some long-dead beast. There's a settlement a day's drive from here. They say they've got wells, maybe enough for a future. She felt a pang of longing, but she knew better than to hope for too much. Maybe I'll see you there someday, she said, though she wasn't certain she would make it. He gave her a long look, as if weighing her words. Then he nodded. Maybe. Without another word, he turned back to his craft, but before he climbed in, he hesitated. He reached into the vehicle once more and took out a second pouch, identical to the first. He placed it on the ground between them and then gave her a nod. For the road, he said simply. And with that, he turned, sealing himself inside the cockpit. A moment later, the craft's engines hummed to life, and he began to roll away, kicking up a low plume of dust. Alara watched until he was no more than a speck on the horizon, her hand still clutching the second pouch of water. It felt like more than just a gift. It was a lifeline, a spark of hope in a world that had long since forgotten what hope even looked like. As she stood there, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting the desert in hues of amber and crimson, she realized that his gift hadn't just been water. It was a reminder, a small yet profound message. For the first time in years, Alara felt a sense of purpose stir within her. She could make it, and maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to be that spark of kindness for someone else too.